Imagine a position where you completely paralyze all enemy pieces and they helplessly witness how their king is getting checkmated. But what strategy do you need to employ to create such a devastating situation? In this video, we will answer this question by analyzing Paul Keres' extraordinary game, which culminates in a truly unique and unforgettable position. So, let's dive in. Keres starts with e4 and his opponent Oscar Panno plays the Sicilian defense. After knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6 and knight c3, Panno goes for the Najdorf variation, a6, taking the b5 square under control and preparing the expansion on the queen side with the b5 advance. Keres opts for the variation with bishop g5, developing the bishop, probably preparing the long castle later in the game, and threatening to capture on f6, doubling black's pawns on the f-file. That's why black's main reply is e6. Now, if white captures, of course, black has an option to capture with the queen, keeping his pawn structure intact. White immediately starts the expansion on the king side with f4. Now black must constantly reckon with the possible threats of either e5 or f5. And black's most common replies are the developing moves, either bishop e7 or knight d7, but black also has one more option. Instead of developing the minor pieces, black can play queen b6, the poisoned pawn variation, targeting the weak b2 pawn. After which white has two main options. He can either defend the pawn, and the best way of doing that is knight b3, closing the queen's way to b2, or white can play more aggressively, sacrificing the pawn, and that's exactly what Keres does. He plays queen d2, defending the knight and letting black capture on b2. And that would be the most logical move for black. He played queen b6, attacking the pawn. White hasn't defended it, so the most consistent thing to do for black would have been to capture on b2, attacking the rook, winning a pawn. But of course, this variation is called a poisoned pawn variation for a reason. White gets a very good compensation and very strong initiative for the pawn. He plays rook b1, attacking the queen, developing the rook with a tempo. The queen must retreat, so the white rook puts pressure on the b-file. White has lead in development. As you see, black has developed only the knight and the queen, while white developed a lot of pieces, as you see. Besides that, white can start a very strong attack with f5, putting pressure on e6, but the computer evaluates this position as equal. But of course, for a human, it's very dangerous to accept this sacrifice, so instead of queen takes b2, which was the best move, Panno plays knight c6. But now, Keres simply castles queenside, defending the b2 pawn. Now black wouldn't have a chance to capture this pawn anymore, and it turns out that the black queen is actually badly placed on b6, because she is blockading the b pawn, and black cannot push the pawn to b5 in order to initiate the counterplay on the queen side. For this reason, Panno decides to exchange the queens. He captures on d4, and after queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and rook takes d4, they transition into the endgame where white has a slight advantage on account of his better development. As you see, white has developed 3 pieces, while black has developed only 1 piece. Besides that, white has the space advantage. His pieces are occupying the 4 ranks, while the black pieces, the black army is squeezed on the 3 ranks. Besides that, the d6 pawn is a backward pawn, and white will put a lot of pressure on it. Besides that, again, white constantly threatens to play e5, which would attack both the knight and d6. And in order to prevent this threat once and for all, Panno plays knight d7, taking this square under control, preventing the e5 advance. But there is also a deeper idea behind this move, behind knight d7. And just in a few moves we will see what Panno has in mind. Keres continues his development with bishop e2, opening the second rook's way to the d-file in order to increase the pressure. And now that the black knight has moved away from f6 and white cannot exchange his bishop for it, black plays h6. The bishop, which cannot exchange anymore, has the only option: it must retreat to h4, and only now we can see Panno's idea. He wants to place his knight on the great e5 square. At the moment it's impossible, of course, because the f4 pawn controls it, but Panno prepared a temporary pawn sacrifice. He plays g5 in order to deflect the white pawn from f4, after which his knight will be greatly placed on the central e5 square. So Keres captures on g5. Now, of course, if black recaptures, then white simply captures and wins a pawn, and black doesn't have the sufficient compensation for a pawn. Panno wasn't going to sacrifice a pawn, it was the temporary sacrifice, so he's going to get his pawn back. So as h takes g doesn't work, black must think about something else. Bishop e7 looks like the natural move, so black, by playing bishop e7, is pinning the g-pawn, so the g-pawn cannot move forward or cannot capture on h6 as the bishop on h4 would fall, and by playing bishop e7, black would prepare to get his pawn back with h takes g. However, in this case, Keres prepared bishop g3, and no matter how black captures on g5, his d6 pawn would fall, and again white would be up a pawn. For this reason, instead of h takes g or bishop e7, Panno plays knight e5. That was the reason he temporarily sacrificed his pawn. Now he has a great knight on e5. And now he is ready to play bishop e7, followed by h takes g, getting his pawn back. So what should white do? Should he keep his extra pawn? If he does that, by capturing on h6, it's true, white would be up a pawn, but black's pieces would become very active. Black already has a great knight on e5, and if white captures on h6, the bishop would also be activated. With a check, the king must move, and bishop e3 is possible, with the discovered attack on the bishop and on the rook. It's true, white can save material by playing bishop f6, moving away the bishop and attacking the rook, but after the exchange of the rooks, black can play bishop d7, and next move he will play king e7. With the attack on the bishop, white would be forced to exchange his bishop for the great knight, after which black would get the advantage of two bishops, so he would have a very good compensation for a pawn. A bishop pair. Besides that, he can think about exchanging his bishop for the knight, ruining white's pawn structure, or he can continue playing with two bishops. He can activate his second bishop, putting more pressure on e4, so the position would be more or less equal in this case. For this reason, instead of keeping his extra pawn by capturing on h6, Keres finds a much more interesting idea, a strategic idea. He wants to paralyze his opponent's queen side. So he spots a weakness on black's queen side, the b6 square. So he plays knight a4 with the idea of invasion b6, blockading the b-pawn with a tempo, attacking the rook, after which the bishop and the rook will be isolated from the remaining black army. And black should have prevented this by playing b5. Of course, white still would be better after knight b6, but at least the pawn which has left the b7 square wouldn't be blockaded, and after rook b8, knight takes c8, it's true, white gets the advantage of two bishops. Besides that, white can capture on h6, remaining the extra pawn. However, after bishop takes h6 check, king b1, at least black pieces are active. As you see, his rook is occupying the half open file, the knight is great, the bishop is active. It's true, the d6 pawn is under attack, but black can defend it, let's say, by playing bishop g7, white doesn't have time to capture because his bishop is under attack, and after he plays bishop g3, for example, black can defend the d6 pawn by playing knight c4, defending the pawn with the discovered attack on the rook, and white is still slightly better, but black pieces are quite active. As you see, all black pieces are quite actively placed. But in our game, instead of this, instead of the b5 advance, Panno, it seems that Panno wasn't ready to sacrifice a pawn. He sacrificed the pawn temporarily. So now it's time to get the pawn back, Panno thought. So instead of b5, he plays bishop e7, preparing h takes g next move. However, now white executes his strategic idea. The knight invades b6 and with a tempo, and the queenside is blockaded, and the queenside pieces are isolated and trapped now. The rook must move to b8, and in the anticipation of h takes g, which would come with a tempo, the bishop would fall under attack, Keres moves his bishop away in advance, bishop g3, putting pressure on this diagonal. And Panno gets his pawn back. Now the material balance has been re-established. However, black's position is passive, especially his queenside is paralyzed, and black would love to finish his development with bishop d7 and bishop c6. If he succeeds in doing that, then he would equalize. However, unfortunately for black, bishop d7 right away doesn't work. If black plays bishop d7 next move, white would simply capture on e5, eliminating this knight. Black would be forced to recapture with a pawn, after which the d file would open, and the rook, together with the knight, would attack the bishop, and the bishop would fall. So the queenside bishop pieces are still isolated. And Keres increases the pressure on the d file. He develops his last piece, rook d1. So, in order to be able to play bishop d7 next move, at the moment it doesn't work because of bishop takes e5, d takes e, and the bishop falls, so the d file opens. So in order to be able to play bishop d7, Panno plays f6. Now, if white captures the knight, he would capture with the f pawn, and the d file would remain close. So black is ready to play bishop d7, and if he manages to do it, bishop d7, bishop c6, he would equalize. And we have reached the critical position. You can pause the video and try to find how Keres prevents black from developing this bishop and keeps his queenside pieces trapped. He plays c4, preventing bishop d7. Now, if bishop d7, the c pawn would move further to c5, and it turns out that the d6 pawn would fall. Next move, white would simply capture it, with the tempo getting a passed pawn on d6, because black cannot capture on c5 for the same reason. The d file would open. Of course, his rook is under attack, but he would capture the bishop with a rook, and after knight takes d7, rook takes d7, white is up in material. For this reason, after c4, as he still cannot develop his queenside, black simply castles. His h8 rook isn't doing much because h2 pawn is defended by the g3 bishop, so he castles, bringing the rook into play. However, black doesn't have any active plan. His queenside is still paralyzed. His knight, of course, is greatly placed, but it isn't doing much. So the bishop is passive, the rook isn't doing anything, and the lonely knight cannot do anything alone. While white has a clear plan. He is going to play c5, opening the d file and increasing his pressure. And after the d file opens, when the right time comes, white is going to exchange his knight for the bishop. Then he's going to exchange his bishop for the knight on e5, so exchanging both pieces, both black pieces, which control the d7 square. And after that, the white rook would invade the 7th rank. And Keres isn't in a hurry to play c5 right away. If he plays c5 right away, black would capture with a tempo, attacking the d4 rook. That's why he first moves the rook away from the d4 square, preparing c5. And Panno understands that he cannot just sit and wait how Keres and see how Keres gradually improves his position, then opens the d file, and that would be the end. So Panno tries to initiate some counterplay. So he plays f5 with the idea of pushing the pawn to f4, closing the bishop's diagonal, after which his knight would remain on e5. After that, he can push the g-pawn forward, then f3, create a passed pawn, so he has some hopes to create counterplay. But Keres ignores the threat of f4 and still plays c5. Now, of course, now that the black pawn is on f5 and it isn't defending the knight, of course, black cannot capture on c5 as he would lose his e5 knight, so Panno must play f4. And now if the bishop moves, then of course that would be in black's favor. He would capture on c5, his pawn would be defended by the bishop, the knight is greatly placed on e5, white cannot exchange this knight, and black has counterplay. He's going to push his pawns, creating a passed pawn. For this reason, after f4, instead of retreating the bishop, Keres of course captures on d6, attacking the black bishop in his turn. Now if black captures on g3, of course white would capture, attacking the rook, and his pawn will be just a terrible pawn. Black cannot hold this position. For example, after rook e8, the white rook invades, threatening to capture, and if black defends his rook, then bishop h5 check would be deadly. The rook on e8 would fall. For this reason, after c takes d, Panno captures on d6, Keres captures on d6, and only now black captures on g3, and after h takes g, the queen side is still paralyzed. And white's pressure is very strong. He has doubled his rooks on the d file. So Panno plays rook f7, hoping to play rook c7 check, followed by rook c6, and exchange a pair of rooks, decreasing white's strong pressure. And if white tries to win a piece, because the black rook has moved away from f8, it isn't defending the bishop. If white plays rook d8 check, trying to exploit this, and after king g7, if he captures on c8, that would be a terrible mistake, because after rook takes c8, knight takes c8, and rook c7 check, black gets the piece back, let's say after king d2, and the position is absolutely equal. White loses all his advantage. For this reason, after rook f7, instead of rook d8 check, Keres plays king b1 in order to prevent rook c7 with a check. So now rook c7 would come without a check. And now white is threatening to invade d8 and win the bishop, because there will be no rook c7 check anymore, which will get the piece back. And for this reason, to save his bishop, Panno plays rook c7, defending the bishop. But now rook d8 check follows, king g7, and what next? Keres now increases the pressure even more. Black still has a great piece, the knight, and Keres plays rook c1, attacking the rook. And if black exchanges, of course, after king takes c1, there is no way he can save the bishop. So white would simply be up a piece. So the idea behind rook c1 is to force the black knight to leave its great blockading square. So the only move black has is knight c6. However, now the entire black army is trapped. It's paralyzed. So the rook cannot move. a8 is controlled by the knight, of course. The bishop cannot move either. If the bishop moves, white can either capture the bishop. Actually, now, after bishop d7, white would capture the rook, and after knight takes b8, white would capture the c7 rook, winning a rook. The rook, the c7 rook, cannot move either because the bishop would fall, and the knight, of course, cannot move because the rook on c7 would fall. So the entire army is trapped. But how should white continue? How should he, what should he do now after paralyzing the entire army? You can pause the video and try to find Keres's move and the idea. So Keres begins the king hunt. The king is helpless, his army cannot help him, so it's time to begin the attack on the lonely black king. And his next move signals the beginning of this attack. e5, taking the f6 square under control, and also d6, so preventing the black king from moving to f6. As the white pawn has moved away from the light square, white's light squared bishop has become much more active. Now the bishop can take part in the attack on the black king. And what can black do? He can only move his king. He has no other moves. So black plays king g6. Now bishop d3 check followed. If the king moves to the edge of the board, he gets checkmated right away after rook h8 check, king g4. White plays rook h3, defending the g3 pawn. The king has no squares to move, and terrible rook c4 check, and checkmate is coming. For this reason, after bishop d3 check, instead of king h5, Panno plays king f7. But now rook h8, threatening rook h7 check, followed by rook takes c7. For this reason, the king comes closer to the rook. Now if rook h7 check, the king would defend his rook. And what next? With his next move, Keres finishes the game. And after his next move, a unique position arises, as he writes. You can pause the video and try to find this beautiful aesthetic move. So the king still has one square to move, the f7 square, and Keres takes this square away too. He plays bishop g6. Now the king doesn't have a single square to move either, and the only moves black has are either g4 or a5, while white is threatening checkmate in 1. And there is nothing black can do about it. For this reason, Panno resigned. And now I recommend watching a game where Keres teaches the highest chess wisdom. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.